I will sorry, I have to learn to use this. These are the contents of the presentation. I will start with multidimensional poverty measure in Latin America until the early 90s. I'm going to tell you the story of poverty measurement in Latin America and in Mexico as an example that the Global South can indeed measure poverty. The second point will be Latin America and Mexico adopt divergent paths in poverty measurement. ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which measures poverty for all the Latin American and Caribbean countries every year, rejects multidimensional poverty measurement. And the improved version of integrated poverty measurement method, which I will explain, is developed and applied in Mexico. So this is the divergence. ECLAC rejects, Mexico develops. In Mexico, two official methods of multidimensional poverty measurement are legally enforced. And the conclusion, can the early 90s Latin American experience and the Mexican recent experience be applicable to other countries in the Global South and to the Global South as a whole? So I start what was happening in Latin America up to the 90s, the early 90s. In those times, the original variant of UBN, unsatisfied basic needs, and the poverty line food normative basket poverty measurement methods were applied separately and with different purposes and level of disaggregation before 1990. We have two methods separately applied. Between 1990 and 1992, a new method developed in Latin America was applied. The original variant of IPMM, original variant of the Integrated Poverty Measurement Method. I will explain now each of these methods as well as the genesis of the original variant of IPM. We start with the differences between UBN, unsatisfied basic needs, and PL methods. UBN is a direct approach, direct observation of the unsatisfaction or satisfaction of human needs, e.g., how many grades of schooling did the person complete? UBN compares the observed or reported condition with its normative threshold. 6 years is the normative, or 12 years is the normative, and the person has 8, you compare, it is below. It identifies the factual unsatisfaction of human needs. PL, poverty line, income or consumption poverty, or indirect approach. It's an indirect approach. Why? Because it compares the resources of a household with the normative resource requirements to satisfy human needs. It identifies potential unsatisfaction of human needs. In other words, it identifies the economic capacity of the household to satisfy human needs. The conception of poverty behind these two methods, as you can see, are different. Factual versus potential satisfaction of needs. Let's look first at the UBN, unsatisfied basic needs method, the original variant, developed and applied in Latin America. It was used to build poverty maps, very disaggregated poverty maps by municipalities. For each UBN direct dimension, a threshold and a dichotomic deprivation indicator, PIJ, indicator A, I for household J, are defined. PIJ is 0 if household, I will use HH as household abbreviation, is on or above the threshold. 1 if it is below. because it's a deprivation indicator. The aggregated deprivation score for household J is the summation of the individual deprivation scores. So household J is poor if Pj is larger than 0. This means that in order to be non-poor in this methodology, a household must have 0 as a score in all indicators. That means it has to be on or above the threshold in all indicators. This again is a dichotomic classification. Households are identified only as poor or not poor. No gradations within each category. The projection is, could it be moved? No. There's nobody to answer. Okay. I'm sorry you are not seeing the complete text. It's okay? Okay. You have to move that.
Not this.
Yes. It's not my computer, it's there. Okay. This methodology has problems. I will list them. First, poverty incidence, H, noted as H, is Q, the number of the poor, divided by N, the population, is not independent of the number of indicators. In fact, H grows with that number. The more indicators you add, the more poor people you will find. 2, it does not allow to calculate poverty intensity or poverty gap, I, neither at the household nor at the aggregate level, and hence to calculate any other aggregated poverty measures or indices like the FGT, the Foster-Greater-Baker, or the SENS index. Second effect. The third effect is it does not take into account 4 of 6 well-being sources. The concept of well-being sources I will explain later. It doesn't take into account current income, it doesn't take into account knowledge and abilities, it doesn't take into account available time, and it doesn't take into account non-basic assets. 4, being an absolute measure with fixed thresholds over time, the trend of poverty as society modernizes is always downwards. The reason for this is that the indicators of UVN are not flow indicators, but stock indicators. So once you have education, you never lose it until you die. So you cannot, so the tendency is always downward, except if you modify the thresholds. Okay, now let's go to the other method that was being applied in Latin America up to the early 90s. The poverty line, and we were applying the food normative basket variant of the poverty line. It is a semi-normative method, normative with respect to raw food and non-normative, empiric in all other needs. It was created by Molly Orshansky and it is applied in the US official poverty measurement method. A normative food basket is defined whose cost, CNFB, is divided by E. E is the Engel coefficient, which is the proportion of income or expenditure devoted to food to obtain PL. Once you have the cost of the food basket, you divided it by E, which is a number between 0 and 1, so the result is larger than what you had. Some authors, e.g. Eklak, consider the cost of the normative food basket as extreme poverty line. The main difference between poverty line food normative basket variants, there are many variants, is which group of households they select to observe the Engel coefficient. Some select poor households, others the whole population, like Orshansky. And lastly, some select a reference stratum or group which satisfies nutritional requirements or whose expenditure on food is equal or slightly larger than the cost of the food normative basket. This is the methodology applied by ECLAC up today. It is still applying this methodology up today. I must say it's a much better method than the World Bank method, and it is applied to 20-something countries in Latin America and the Caribbean every year. So don't think that the World Bank method is the only one that is being currently applied to many poor countries. Of course, OECD has its method, the European Union has its method for many countries, but they are not poor, mainly. The problem with this method of normative food basket is that it only identifies food poverty. They don't recognize it. It's a criticism of myself that I have made. For the average selected group, G, this is a demonstration. I will skip it for reasons of time. I hear, and it's in the paper, I prove algebraically that this method measures food poverty only. That is, those people which with their income cannot buy the food normative basket given the proportion that they allocate to food from their income. So they are food poverty only. So I come to the conclusion that this method should be abandoned. In the reference stratum, it's one of the variants which I was explaining. The conceptual meaning of poverty line normative food basket is clear. We can call it food poverty measurement method and interpret its results in that sense. Given the procedure to calculate poverty line, its nominal value through time will be a function only of food prices. This is a terrible problem because it skews results. Now that you have food prices going up, poverty goes up. When you have very leveled prices of food, poverty was going down very quickly. To overcome the contradictions of poverty line food normative basket and adopt an income poverty method that goes beyond food poverty and comes closer to measuring poverty in general, the only consistent procedure is to build a generalized normative basket known as the family budget method. Instead of building a food basket, a list of foodstuffs, you make a list of all the household needs, including clothes, including shoes, including heating for the house, transportation, etc. The definition, there's another defect of this method is that the definition of extreme poverty using the cost of food, of raw food, as an extreme poverty line is unacceptable, as among other reasons, some foodstuffs cannot be consumed without cooking them. So you need gas or some other cooking. As another reason is that nudity in public places is forbidden, so you need some clothes. And as in most cases, without transportation, one cannot get to the workplace. So it's absurd. Conceptually, it is absurd to measure extreme poverty by the cost of raw food. In this table, I explain the concept of well-being sources. When I was confronted with this reality in Latin America of these two methods being used, UBN and PL, I elaborated a criticism beyond the criticism I have already told you, which is this. The concepts, it's the critique of partial methods. I came to the conclusion that both UBN and PL are partial methods, not integrated methods. Why? Because in my conception, there are 6 sources of well-being for a household. These are the 6 sources: current income, non-basic assets, basic assets, access to free goods and services or public consumption, knowledge and abilities, and free time. These together determine how the level of well-being of a household. And PL only takes into account current income and sometimes non-basic assets. So that's why it's here. And UBN, unsatisfied basic needs, usually takes into account basic assets like the housing unit and access to free services like education or health services, and sometimes knowledge and ability when it considers the level of education of the adult population. But none of the 2 methods take into account free time or available time. So my criticism is, if you see PL takes into account 2 sources of well-being, UBN takes into account 3 sources of UBN from 6, 2 from 6 and 3 from 6. So they are both partial methods. They are incapable of ordering correctly households from the best off to the worst off. So I discovered that these 2 methods were not alternative methods, but complementary methods. When you put them together, they take into account 5 of the 6 well-being sources. And that's what we did in Latin America. We had a project, a UNDP project, and we applied a new methodology, which is the original variant of integrated poverty measurement method. I called it the original variant because later on I improved it. So to distinguish both variants, I called it the original variant. This method originated in the previously presented critique of partial methods. It consists in the application to each household of both the PL, food normative basket, and UBN methods. We take both methods together and combine them. Once this is done, each household is considered poor if it is poor in one or both dimensions. Therefore, poverty incidence is the union of the sets identified by both methods. 3 poverty groups are identified. 1, those that are considered poor by both methods. 2, those that are considered poor only by PL. And 3, those that are seen as poor only by UBN. This typology is the largest attractive of this method, the fact of having 3 different groups of poor. By combining both partial methods, the original variant of IPM comes close to a complete inclusion of the well-being sources. But by doing it in an uncritical way, it drags the limitation of both partial methods. The limitations I have told, if you just combine them, you inherit them, obviously. This table gives an example of the real application in those years, at the end of the 1985. As you can see in Peru, you will have in the lines poor by PL and non-poor by PL, and in the columns poor by UBN and non-poor by UBN. So this group is the only group that is not considered to be poor in this method. the one that is non-poor by both methods. And the other three, underlined with the red color, are poor. These are poor by both methods, and these two are poor by one of the methods only. So the poor by the original variant of IPM or integrated poverty would be the sum of 40.7, 13.5, 16.5. It gives 70.7. So the final criterion of poverty of this new method, which is multidimensional and integrates income with direct indicators for the first time, I think, in the world, for the first time in the world, I think. I'm not completely sure. I am almost sure. Because I haven't read all the literature, but I have read most of the important literature and teach on it. Okay, so it inherits the limitations from the two methods that it integrates. IPM inherits limitations. From PL, food normative basket, it inherits that besides the needs verified by UVN, it only identifies food poverty, so that many needs are omitted. You won't have a dressing, or you won't have other transportation needs and many others. From the UVN, it inherits that age is not independent of the number of indicators, the inability to calculate other poverty indices besides age, the dichotomic character of UVN indicators, and the union criterion adopted in UVN lead also to the adoption of dichotomic results in PL and in integrated poverty, which implies the loss of a lot of information. Dichotomic methods imply losing a lot of information. As UVN thresholds are defined from an absolute and static approach, measured poverty incidence tend to decrease, what I have told you. 6, although it substantially diminishes the partial coverage of well-being sources by integrating both methods, free time is always left out and knowledge ability is left out frequently. By the way, it combines partial methods. A new weakness appears. 7, the union criterion of poverty is highly questionable. If a millionaire does not send a child to school, the household is classified as poor. That's the consequence of using union criteria. So, the next step in the story, Mexico and Latin America move away in poverty measurement. ECLAC rejects multidimensional poverty measurement. I have already told you. I'm going to be quick on this. It was not only ECLAC. Look here. ECLAC rejected the multidimensional approach to poverty measurement, and UNDP Latin America, which was the institutional framework in which the integrated poverty measurement was defined and applied for the first time, also abandoned this methodology when it discontinued the regional project to overcome poverty in Latin America in 1991. Okay. Meanwhile, in Mexico, I completed the development of the new version of IPM, the improved variant of IPM, applied it and lectured on it. As the story told shows, IPM is a method with strong roots in Latin America. We did not copy it from Alkire Foster. Alkire was barely born, and we didn't copy it from the World Bank or any other institution. ECLAC, let's leave ECLAC aside. Let's go to IBM, the improved version of IPM. What does this variant do? This variant was developed by introducing to the original variant of IPN 5 big groups of changes. One, the IB-UBN is replaced by the IB-UBN replaced the original variant of UBN. We have a new version of UBN. PL normative food basket was replaced by the generalized normative basket or family budget method. Time poverty, a third dimension, was added and the procedures to calculate it were developed, 3 steps. And fourth step, the procedure to combine these 3 dimensions were developed, and lastly, the multidimensional poverty criterion was changed. The union of sets criterion was replaced by an average criterion. In what follows, the 5 changes are explained. I have to be quick on this. How much time have I been speaking?
25 minutes are over, but you can have another 5 minutes.
Okay. So, all these 5 changes were made. The first part of this is very important. But in order to replace the original variant of UBN by the improved variant of UBN, requires metric scales above and below the threshold for all indicators and an integration procedure which allows for compensations. This means cardinalization in the economist jargon and using metric indicators according to the generalized jargon. If you have various solutions for water supply which have a degree of from very imperfect to quite perfect, you don't dichotomize. You give them metric numbers to the solutions in between the threshold and the worst position. So you are converting a ordinal indicator into a metric cardinal indicator. This is the essence of the transformation of original variant of UBN to IB-UBN. And this is the most difficult thing to digest for many economists who have a mathematical training and who reject this. This is algebra, the same thing I told you. So once these changes are made, UBN, the new version, overcomes the problems I have told you about the original variant. I don't have time to explain. The important step in poverty line is changing food normative basket, substituting it by a generalized basket, which is in the original tradition of poverty measurement. Even Roundtree in the 19th century did a complete basket, a very minimum basket, but it included some clothing, it included even tobacco and newspapers, etc. So this is going back to the origins, using a complete budget. It's a budget approach. It's being used currently in many countries. The third important change, incorporating the free time dimension, of which Araceli Damiani in the next presentation will give a profound view. This is the most radical change in poverty measurement, and it is the distinguished feature of this method. Human well-being depends not only on financial resources, it depends critically on time resources. To take care of children, for instance, so that they speak instead of abandoning them, etc. I'm rushing, Araceli will explain this. This is the procedure of IPM, the improved version. Some dimensions are covered by UBN, like sanitary conditions, domestic energy, other services like telephone, waste disposal, the dwelling, the quality and spaces of the dwelling is here, education, and furniture and domestic equipment. Many others are covered by PL, which constitute the poverty line, the budget approach. Food, fuel, hygiene, dress and shoes, transport, communications, recreation and culture, etc. And health and social security, which in our countries is covered by institutions only partially, only a small proportion or medium proportion of the population is covered by social security services, has to be dealt in a combined methodology. For those that have access to social security, you manage it as UBN, because you said yes, they covered and you given the okay. But if they have no access to social security, their income should be larger than the normal income in order to buy everything that is covered by income and also health services and social security. And time is combined here, and I will, the procedure of combination, and I will finish because I don't want to abuse time more, is you combine first income with time, which is what I explained here, but I don't have time to go in detail. And once the critical combination is labor, income, and time. So if your income derived from labor, you have to correct it by the number of hours that you have worked. If you work the standard hours, you leave it like that, you divide by 1. If you overwork, you divide it by 1 point something, so your income goes down. So it measures the income that you would have from labor if you work the standard hours promoted in your society. And this is a combination, and then you get a new indicator, which is income time indicator. And the last step of integration is you combine IBM, IBUBN with YT, which is income time. Each one gets a weight. These Ks are weights. These weights, what I prefer to use is social costs of satisfaction of the needs included in one and the other package. You can change weights. It's not essential element in the methodology. The important thing, and the other thing is, I have tested the robustness of this method by using absurd weights for my results, and the range of variation of results is very small. Surprisingly small. So weights are not as important as philosophers think. Amartya Sen thinks that as we have not resolved the problem of weights, we cannot do multidimensional measurements. I finish with this, yes. Just coming back to the original questions, are the analyzed experience applicable to other countries in the global south and to this as a whole? Latin America was capable in the period 1990-1992 of measuring its own poverty with its own methods, not copied from anywhere, but developed in an endogenous intellectual process. The Mexican experience, lasting now for more than 20 years, shows that the national government and the local government, as well as some members of the academy, can also measure their own poverty using their own methods. In all three cases involved in the stories told in this paper, the methods applied were multidimensional and far better than the one applied globally by the World Bank for a long time and by UNDP, the new Alquire Santos methodology that started in 2010. So the answer to the question in the title of the present paper is an emphatic yes, we can, followed by a second also emphatic answer. Yes, we can do it better than what the global institutions are doing nowadays. So that what is lacking is to get South-South relations, organizations organized, ECLAC moving to multidimensional poverty measures, and the Economic Commission for the Pacific and Asia and so on together, and we could have our own methodologies, and we can have our own Millennium Development Goals or new, because these development goals were based on the World Bank measurement, the ones we have. We could have very different goals, believe me. Thank you.